Welcome back to my budget app series, where I attempt to create a personal finance application from scratch and document the whole process on YouTube. In this video, I will be working on the Next.js web client. More specifically, I'll be implementing the authentication workflow. This includes the login, a persistent login session, and logout functionalities. If you haven't followed the budget app series so far, but are interested in a general Next.js authentication implementation, you can watch this video just as well. What I'll be showing is very general and will apply to any application that does authentication in a Next.js client with JSON Web Token. The method I'll be implementing will be very simple, but also maintainable and extendable if you would like to include extra functionality. I want to keep it as minimal and simple as possible. Without further ado, let's jump into the code and I'll show you what we'll be implementing. Alright, to start, I have the monorepo open, of course. I will need the backend service for the authentication API and the web client to implement the actual authentication login, persistent session, and logout. To do so, I have prepared only a few things before the video. I will first start the monorepo Docker container with all the services with Docker Compose up. We set this up a few videos back. This just starts the Next.js client, the backend service, and its database. So now if I open the client, we have two views. One is budget, which is very simple. It only has some text to identify that this is the budget view. And it opens by default because I added a redirect in the next.config.js so that the root directory permanently redirects to budget. This will be the main dashboard for budgets. And we have the login view where I've done some basic login card and form for email and password with Tailwind and the components we built in BW UI. These components are label, input, and button. Very straightforward. We just have a flex container that centers everything and it's white gray. Then a card in it with shadow and a white background, and a form with flex layout and the email input, the password input, an error message, which will indicate any server-side errors, and the sign-in button. And if I go to that view, you can see how it looks. It's very straightforward, nothing special. Just email, password, and error message. This will only show up if we have an error message, of course. And the sign-in button. I have some basic HTML5 validation. This is basically these two fields are required. That's it. All right. So now to build the actual authentication, we need to look at our endpoints. In the backend service, we have a users controller where we have a post request for login. There we go. So the post request to users creates a new user. This is registration basically. And the post request with the login endpoint will basically accept a user and check if the user email is valid. Then check the password, and if the email and password are valid, it will create a JWT token and send the token and some user details back as JSON. All right. So this is the endpoint, and we also have the API v1. So let's test the endpoint first with Postman. Basically, the API is currently at localhost or the local IP, it doesn't matter. Port 3001, API v1, and then users, because that's the controller, and then login. And that is a post request. And that's what we need to send. The body should be JSON. Let me find that. And it expects a user object with email. Let's just send a test email and password. So if I send this request, it should return a message that the user details are incorrect. Yeah, the provided user details are invalid. This is absolutely expected. Now I have a test user. By the way, this is another thing I did off camera. We have this seed data script in the BW backend service. It's just a Node.js script that creates some data in the database, because the first time I create the database and start this service in the Docker container, it's empty. and it doesn't have any details. And that's not good for development, testing, etc. I need at least one test user, test transaction, test budget. And that's what this script does. It seeds data. That's a term used frequently with ORMs. And this script is very simple. I have these functions to create a transaction, to create a category, to create a user. And these just use the model classes, just like the controllers do, the models of the type ORM models, transaction to create a transaction. And here's the function that runs. It just creates a user, then creates some categories, salary, food, mortgage, fund, whatever, and a couple of transactions. And all of these are for testing purposes and so that we have some data. And if I delete the database and I need to delete the database, this script just runs automatically and seeds my testing data the first time I start and create the database container. Notice that it checks in the beginning because if you try to create a user with the same email, it has a unique constraint, of course, and it will throw an error. In that case, the script will just output that the data is already seeded and proceed to start the server. This has no performance overhead on the server as it executes only one time when the server starts. So this is pretty standard practice, but I wanted to point it out because this is the test user that we have to work with now. John Doe with test user at budget warden and a password. All right, so let's add that, send these details in the pulse request and check if we'll get the details of the user and his token back as expected. Do I have an error? Yes, white space right here. Okay, here we go. This is everything we want. A token and the user ID, first and last name. Great, this is awesome. So at this point, I can just go back. All right. And I can now create my action right here. So this is a form and it needs to send a HTTP request to this same endpoint that we did with Postman. And it will receive the details, the token and the user details back. And it needs to save that somewhere so that we have a persistent session. You don't want the user to log in on every view, of course. Now, in that case, what we need to do is save basically the token and user details in an HTTP only cookie. Next.js has a utility for that, for cookies. So that's straightforward. The only caveat here is we can only use them server side, which means that we have to make a Next.js server action to log in, and the function we'll make to basically gate views for authenticated users only will work on server-side rendered server components only. So that's not a problem. It means that all of our pages which are gated need to be server components. This is absolutely no problem because any client components can be a subcomponent of that page. The page can always be a server component, basically, architecturally. And let me demonstrate how we're going to build actions. I will first create in the source directory, maybe in the in the source directory, I'll create an actions folder and I will make a file called user actions. I want my actions, my server-side actions in my client to follow the data structure of the backend service. This way, the actions will be grouped in a logical way because the actions will follow the RESTful API, basically. All right, so here we need a login action. First, let's specify use server at the top. We need a login action, and an action is just a function, asynchronous function that accepts form data, and it will just basically do an action on the server. So let's do that. Let's post with this action. I will import login. Do I export it? Not yet. I will just console log in this action right now to see that we are executing it. So I'll import the action. Okay. And it will just be the action of the login form. Now, If I, let me close Postman. If I post this form, I just did that, I get login action, but notice, I don't get that in my client because this isn't executing in the browser, in the client. This is executing on the server that is running basically the Next.js, the Node.js application that is running the Next.js web client. So I'm basically making a server-to-server request, and Next.js is handling the server to actual client, meaning this HTML page with some JavaScript. So that communication will also be an HTTP request, but Next.js does it smartly with server actions so that it returns the user interface updates together with the data. You don't need to worry about that at all. This is handled in the framework, so that's fine. And we get server-to-server communication here. And the good thing about that is here we can use the cookies, HTTP cookies utility in Next. We can do many things. We can redirect everything. And let me just change basis to 2. Okay. Now, the next step here is to actually be able to return error messages as well, because right now we are not. Let me just open the server actions documentation. We can use this useFormState React function. This is a React hook from the React DOM library, and it's specifically for server actions. Let me import it at the top from React DOM. And this now needs to be a client component because we're using a React DOM hook that modifies state and stuff. Now, this isn't a problem because a client component can use a server action. That's absolutely fine. Of course, it can. But now, this useFormState, so it has initial state, which I'll specify here. My state will just be an error message in case there is any. All right. And then it accepts an action, which in my case will be login. And it returns the action and state. So now the action will become this form action, and the state will be potentially contain message like this. Sorry. Let me see. Okay. Now, is that it? Yeah. That's why it was erroring, because here we never return. Now, here's how it works. In my action, if I return this object with message, it will update the state. And in my action, I am now expected to not have just form data, but previous state, which is any, and form data. So I get the previous state, I can return the next state update, and I get the form data. That's how it works. Quite straightforward, really. And the update won't happen with any refresh, the action won't execute, the page will execute a client-side script, it will update itself, it will get the updated UI, everything. The user experience will be great, so no need to worry about that. So now that we have that handled, we can just make the HTTP request now. And that will be a fetch request. Let me do that. Of course, the fetch API is asynchronous. I will make a constant for the backend service URL. Now, one thing to notice. From the Next.js server, the URL of the backend service, the API, the IP, and the network location where the Next.js node application, the Next.js node application, reaches our backend service, which is a Fastify application, is not local host to it. It's not 127.0.0.1. It's not local because we have a network here. We are in a Docker environment and we have 3 services: backend service, web client, and database. And they have a network that's shared between them. But they are sort of like different endpoints on this network. And we can use their names right here as host names because they're in the same Docker container and on the same network. So this web client can identify the backend service with this host name, which is very convenient. And the service URL is API v1. And that I will export from a config file right here in source. This config file will have a couple of constants exported like this. And I'll import service URL. Okay. So now I can fetch users login. And let's specify the request options separately for readability. I like to do that. Obviously, this variable is worthless otherwise. So the method is a post method. We have headers. Content type is application JSON because we're sending and receiving JSON. And then we have body, which will be JSON, stringify user, user object here, which will have an email. That will be form data get email and password. That will be form data get password. Okay. And that basically wraps the request options. So now we send this request. Let's wrap this in a try block. It could have an exception here. So in case there's an error, what we'll do is return message error. So no. So if error has a message property, let me check. Like error can be any. If error has a message property, return message. Okay, so the standard error type usually has a message. Otherwise, return the error to string. That will be sufficient. Now, in any other case, we don't have an error here, an exception. This would usually be an exception occurring when if the server is not available, but the client is. Some very specific case where a network problem occurs, for example. Now, the other case is when we have a 500 code and the user details are incorrect. In that case, we won't throw an exception here, but request status will not be 200. And in that case, first of all, let's parse the request to JSON. So this will get the JSON response. If the request status is not 200, then return message, which will be response message. We will have a message in that case. And otherwise, we're basically logged in. So what we'll do in that case is very simple. For now, we'll return a message, but later we will save a cookie and redirect. Okay, that's it. As you can see, most cases should be handled, at least the basic ones. Okay, let's test. Something might go wrong. First, let's do a wrong email and password. That's pretty good. That's actually awesome. Now let's do the real credentials. Great. This is awesome. So now the next step is to implement the cookies. Let me open the Next.js documentation, cookies. Okay. As you can see, we have cookies in next headers. As I mentioned, this can only be used in a server component or a server action. So basically, I can get the cookie store here. And then we can just use cookies set, cookie store, set token to a value. And this value will be the response token. Okay. And then I will set user as JSON stringify response user. Okay. Great. So now that we have set the cookies, we can also redirect. And that can happen with another Next.js utility. If I start typing, I get a recommendation. It's from Next Navigation. There it is. And I can just redirect to budget. So after a successful login, we always redirect to budget, the root main view basically. Okay, let's test again. All right, login, sign in, budget. Works great. Now, the next step is Basically, the login view works great now. Let's make sure that these cookies don't stay. Right now, they'll stay indefinitely. You don't want that. Always expire cookies for security reasons and also because your users will basically just forget their password. So that's an issue. Now, the cookies, let me see, where should we go? We can basically, sorry, it's in the same view. Expires, there we go. Expires is a timestamp right here. And this will expire it in 1 day ago. Basically, we need to pass to each of these like this. And I want to expire my cookies after 30 days. That's a good period. It's not too short, but not too long. And this is 1 day, so I'll just multiply it by 30 and rename this to 30 days. And this will be plus today plus 30 days. Actually, I can create an expiration timestamp, which will be this. Great. Now my cookies will expire. Quite awesome. Okay. Now we need to be able to actually gate views to check if user is logged in. If he's not, don't show a route. This budget route, for example, shouldn't be accessible if you're not logged in. You won't be able to see any data. And you should be redirected to login. In case you're logged in, the budget view should have the token and user ID, and it should be able to basically, you should be able to access it without being redirected. To do that, I'll create a hook, a helper. To do so, I'll create a helpers folder in the source directory of the web client, and I'll call it out TypeScript. So the hook will be useAuth. Okay. And here's what it's going to do. It will use the same cookies and redirect. Okay. So it will get the cookie store. And after that, it will take the token. And the user. And it has to check if token or user are not defined. It will basically redirect to login and stop this function. Otherwise, we can, that's fine. Otherwise, let me change to 2 spaces. I needed to reinstall my IDE. I think that might be better. Yeah. So as I was saying, otherwise we want to return, the user and token, both. But user is a stringified JSON, so let's first parse it after we check that it's available. I will just do this. It should be absolutely fine. What's the problem? Oh yeah, here we need value. What's wrong? Yeah, it is possibly undefined. Okay, great. So this useAuth will be exported, and now I can use my helper in the budget view. To use it, I just have to import it, use auth. There we go. And here I can get my user and token just like that. And this will make sure that my budget view is gated. So let's test that right now. I will also console log them right now to make sure they are actually available. Have my budget view. I get my token and user, and I'm logged in now. I have a cookie, but if I make a new incognito window, I'll create a new incognito window, and I try to access it, I get redirected to login. If I do it again, I get redirected to login. And if I actually log in, I can access it. So everything is working absolutely as expected. All right, so the next step will be to actually implement logout, which will be another user action right here. All right. And logging out is very simple. Cookie store has a delete function, delete the token, delete the user, and I immediately redirect to login. And now in the budget, we can add a test button to log out. On click, I'll just execute that. Server-side actions can not only be form methods and actions, form actions, but they can be executed on click as well. So let's run that. Here we have the button. If I press it, let me see. We get a client-side exceptions. Yeah, okay, I am passing something here. I have to just execute it like this. Okay, I mean, this should be fine as well. Yeah. Let me see. To client component props. Yeah, so basically this needs to be a client component. So I will make a logout button component. That won't be a problem later because this logout button will be part of the sidebar navigation basically. But now I need to create a separate component, especially for this test, until we implement the sidebar navigation. So this will be a client component, which will return this JSX. Okay. I will also import logout, the action, and this will have the use client directive. And now I can just import that logout button component. There we go. Okay, let's test. I get logged out. Now if I go to budget, I'm logged out. If I log in, everything should be accessible in theory. Let me just stop the server real quick. Okay, yeah, and we can access budget. All right, so we have login, persistent session, and logout. The last step will be to implement a registration view. I will copy the login and actually create a new folder. I'll call it sign up. I'll copy the login as I said, as it will be a similar cart, but we'll have email, password, first and last name. And a repeat password field. Okay. The name of this will be password. Okay, email, password. Here we need to change the names to first name. It's just labels, but they need to be updated. Of course, last name. And here we change that to sign up. Okay. Sign up. We don't have it yet. Why is that? Is something wrong? It's in the app folder. Let me restart just in case. And I'll call this sign up, of course. Okay. There it is. I will put first and last name after email and the passwords last right here. Okay. And we still have the error message, but we'll create a new action here, which will be sign up. Or yeah, sign up is fine. It will accept the same previous state. It will be an async function, of course. So let's import that. That's great. And now we just have to parse the data and send the HTTP request. So I'll copy this. Let's first copy the request part. All right. We will make a post request to the actual, again, a post request with user, email, password, first name. All right. And that should be sufficient. We will make a post request to users with the following request options. Again, check this, check for errors the same way. And if everything is fine, we should redirect. First, do this check as well. Parse the response to JSON. Okay, if it's not 200, return the error message. The same mechanism to return the error message. And then if everything is fine, redirect to login. Okay. Now I would also console log the response while we are testing. Okay, great. Now we also need to check the repeat password field, and that can happen before, right here, before sending a request. Just get the password. All right. If password doesn't equal repeat password, we will just return an error message. The two passwords do not match. That's sufficient. So let's test that first. First of all of the fields are required, of course. I would attempt to create the same user so that I get an error message that we have a unique constraint, etc. Let's do a password that doesn't match. Okay, this didn't work at all. That's not good. Let me check what is happening right now. I think I am sending. Yeah, this is not saved at all. I was sending a login action still. So let's log out. Yeah, sign up and fill it again. So yeah, the two passwords don't match. If they match, yeah, we have this unfriendly error saying that this email already exists. If I try again, we created a user and now I should be able to go. There we go. Test user 2. All right. That should be working. But it isn't. Let me check. Why is that? Let me just restart my server real quick in case I have some issue. Okay. Yeah, my user is working. I'm logged out now. Let's sign up again. Let's get another user. So we have this issue right here. What is that? Let me check. If I open a new incognito window, does that occur? Yes, it does. Okay. Let's troubleshoot that. I think we don't log in successfully at all. So I will console log the login response right here and check what that is. And here I can remove that console log for the sign up response. So if okay, that seems to work now. I logged in successfully. Let's test it again in a new incognito window. Okay, so what is happening now? Login response is correct. It seems like. But in the budget view, we don't seem to go there, really. Okay. Here in auth, something is wrong. Let's check it here. Whoops. Auth. Yeah, in authentication, everything is correct. Yes, everything seems correct, and it worked now. So this seems to be some glitch in the dev mode of Next. Yeah, I don't think this will be a production error, so I'll leave it for now until I can reproduce it again. The important stuff is we have our, we've built our sign up, login, and the helper that lets us basically check if a user is authenticated and get a page only for authenticated users. And to also have the user details available to send HTTP requests to the actual API there, which will be useful in the next video when we'll be building the budget view. With this, I'll wrap today's video. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to subscribe to get notified when another video is released. Take care.